Hey y'all. So today we're going to take a deep dive into the world of cucurbits. Cucurbits are a crop that probably most of you recognize as being our pretty popular vine crops that we grow in our gardens this time of year, even harvesting all the way up until frost. And you can see the crops listed there on the left, everything from cucumbers to summer squash, watermelons, gourds, and even loofah. We do know that there are 965 species known within this family, the cucurbit family. And the cucurbit family is also the species with the most food used for human consumption. All of these vining crops are going to have bright yellow flowers and produce a male and female flower, with the exception of the bottle gourd. Another cool feature about vining crops is that they all have these little tendrils that you see here. Just some useful tips as we get started with producing and growing cucurbits is that they do in fact prefer warm soils. So if you are living in Northeast Tennessee, you know in fact that the last couple of days have been rather hot. So soil temperature is just right. So just to give you an FYI, today is May the 26th, and we've had some record-breaking heat up here in the Northeast counties. We do want full sun. That's going to help with any of those mildew problems we'll talk about a little bit later. We can tolerate some alkaline soils, but that's typically not something we find in abundance, again, in Northeast Tennessee. When it comes to nitrogen, the NPK ratio on a fertilizer bag, we want nitrogen to be that lowest number, and we want phosphorus and potassium to be a little bit higher, because that's where we're going to get that fruit production. Again, they do all have tendrils, and then we do have female and male flowers on the same plant. Therefore, we don't want to be saving seeds from year to year. In regard to the flower, this is a picture of the male flower. So these are actually going to be the first flowers that appear. Male blossoms are not going to bear an immature fruit behind the petals. And I'll show you a picture here in a few minutes, like the female flowers do. They're actually going to furnish this pollen that you see here for the bees to pollinate the female flowers. And then once they've done their job, which is pollination here, then they will just drop off the plant naturally without any type of fruit production. Now the female flowers, they're going to have this ovary that you see here directly behind the flower, and it's going to look like a miniature fruit. So when it's pollinated, this is when it's going to swell up to form the fruit. If the female flower actually blooms before there are male flowers to supply the pollen, they'll dry up, or they're going to produce a really small fruit that will just drop off and die. It really won't make anything. And I've got a picture to show you about what that looks like here in a few minutes too. Again, just remember that the first flowers that appear are going to be the male. And you can kind of see the difference in what those two flowers in fact look like. So that's your botany lesson for today. We're not going to take a deep dive into that, but I did want you to be aware that we do have both male and female flowers on the same plant. So sometimes when we do get into a pollination issue, then we will see some of that immature fruit, and often folks will think that that is a fertility issue or even disease, but when in fact it is going to be directly related to pollination. Now, cucurbit tips, as far as growing, they're going to be really deeply rooted. So we only want to give about 1 inch of water per week, and we want to do that pretty slowly. We want it to completely soak that soil about 6 to 8 inches deep. And as with most any of our crops, we want to be watering in the morning or early afternoon, because we want that foliage to be completely dry by evening. And this is probably really important for squashes, maybe more so than some of our other crops, or not squashes per se, but any vining crop, any member of the cucurbit family, because of the downy and powdery mildews. So those are going to be 2 leaf diseases we really want to be conscientious of. Now, as we move into the season, we start producing that fruit, that's when we want to back off on the watering, because that's what's going to actually encourage that fruit to mature. And at that time, at that growth of the, or that stage of growth of the plant, the root system should be more extensive and be able to withstand some of those drier conditions. Now, a drought might be another situation, and we would have to continue to do some light watering in those situations. And you know, we're kind of maybe wondering if we're going to get into a dry, hot summer this year. So we'll just kind of have to keep an eye on that, depending on where all of us are tuning in from. Now, you are going to get a publication on this, so don't fret about trying to read all this. I just wanted to put a picture in here, so I would be sure to say refer to the Vine Crops publication, and that's going to help guide you as far as in row spacing and in between the rows, and in regard to Tennessee planting in the east versus the west, because you can see there's some pretty substantial differences. So we're right in the window here in the east, but for those of you living in the west, maybe some of you are already maybe harvesting fruit, but make sure you refer to that. And there's actually a live link here in the program presentation to take you to that publication. Just a few other maybe words of caution is that in some studies, some of our sister land grants, we've noticed that you'll lose yield when you transplant cucurbits rather than just seeding them directly into the ground in your garden. And the reason for that is just root stress. They're going to be really slow to overcome that stress. It's going to kind of stunt them back just a little bit. Not to say that it will kill them or they won't thrive. It's just going to give them a temporary setback. Many people actually plant seeds in mounds. That gives a little bit better rooting depth. It gives the seed just a little bit more of a kickstart. If you do use transplants, just be aware. Make sure that you handle those roots with caution. We want to disturb that root ball as little as possible, and give it, you know, give quite a bit of water when you first transplant those, or they are really bad to wilt down. I will tell you, just in my own observations in my own garden, I can plant a transplant in the garden and sow seeds a couple weeks later, and every single time the seeds will overtake the transplant. So always seems to be a healthier, more sturdier plant, just as an FYI. But that's just Melody's observations. So again, just seeds versus transplant. Many of your scientists are going to tell you direct seeding is the only way to be able to ensure that that plant is going to reach its full potential. And again, that's just because of the root disturbance, that really long taproot. And we've also heard, you know, I do a lot of teaching on folklore and some of those things, but farmers will also tell you that if you direct seed those plants, that they're going to resist frost better, and they'll often produce a larger and earlier crop than your transplants. And I've seen that occurrence as well in my own garden. Just a really quick fun fact, botanically, a melon is going to be a type of berry, y'all, and we call that a pepo. And it is a type of berry that's derived from an inferior ovary. So any fleshy, watery fruit of the melon or cucumber type with numerous seeds and a firm rind is going to fall into this category. And you can kind of see that here from our crop species there on the left versus the cultivar selections. Now, some of this is going to change as you, as home gardeners across the state, are participating in our statewide home garden veggie trials. So, but this is just a link to that, and it's going to give you some more information, and that too is included in the Google Drive and on the web portal too for convenience. So now what we'll do is spend a little time on each one of these crops specifically, pointing out some harvest tips, planting tips, and all that good stuff, and give you a little bit of information about their origin. So in regard to cucumbers, or Cucumis sativus, which is the Latin, they actually originated in India. And they have been cultivated for about 3,000 years and was probably introduced to other parts of Europe by the Greeks or the Romans, or a combination of both. Just as an FYI and as a fun fact, cucumbers are mentioned in the Bible, and it was one of the foods that was eaten by the Israelites in Egypt. Charlemagne had cucumbers grown in his gardens, and that was 8th, 9th century. And then the Spaniards actually brought cucumbers to Haiti in 1494, and that was via Christopher Columbus. And then Jacques Cartier, the French explorer, that I probably just slaughtered his name there, but in 1535, he found very great cucumbers growing in Montreal, Canada. Of course, it wasn't Montreal, Canada at that time, but it is where current day Montreal is now. Really cool thing about cucumbers is that they can cool the temperature of the blood. So anytime you ladies get facials, often there will be cucumber enzymes. We've talked about that in some of our phytochemistry classes. And then sunburns, it's almost as good as aloe, or maybe even better, depending on your preference at cooling sunburns. If you have bad breath, y'all, cucumbers can actually annihilate halitosis. If you're really stressed, boil a cucumber because the chemicals create a relaxing aroma. And you can also take a cut cucumber and defog a mirror, like after a shower, and it'll clear that right up. Now, when we talk about cucumbers, we're going to break it down just a little bit here into slicers, picklers, and seedless. And then we also have parthenocarpic. Now, when we talk about parthenocarpic, that means that we have seedless fruit, and that can occur without any type of pollination. So oftentimes you're going to see these grown in greenhouses where there are no bees, or bees are excluded. But to kick us off, we'll talk a little bit about the slicers to start with. And this is a picture here that just popped up of the slicers. They are actually going to be grown to eat fresh. Oftentimes you're going to hear them called slicing cucumbers. The main varieties of slicers are going to mature on the vine with really large leaves that are going to provide pretty much ample shading for the plant. They're mainly eaten in the unripe green form, since when they turn yellow, they become very bitter and very sour. So slicers are going to be grown commercially for the North American market, for those longer, smoother, more uniform in color, kind of like you see here. And they're going to have a much tougher skin. If you travel to other countries, those slicers are going to be smaller and have a thinner, more delicate skin. And they'll often have fewer seeds, and they're going to be sold in a plastic skin for protection. And sometimes those are going to be called English cucumbers. So yes, if y'all are thinking about that right now and slicing your heads, listen to me, nodding your heads, then you know that in fact we do have English cucumbers on the shelves at our supermarkets today. And those are going to be our slicing cucumbers. Now, a favorite of many home gardeners are going to be the picklers. And you can see there why they're called picklers. Some folks will actually even pickle the entire cucumber. But they're called picklers because we're going to pickle those with brine, sugar, vinegar, and spices, so we can create all kinds of great tasty things. Dill, sweet, or bread and butter, all kinds of different pickles. So any cucumber is going to be able to be pickled. Commercial pickles are actually made from cucumbers that are specially bred for uniformity of length. Length, let's see if I can show you here, length to diameter ratio. And we don't want any voids in that flesh if they're pickling that entire cucumber. Any cucumber that's about 3 to 4 inches long, we'll typically call those picklers. And as far as being compared to slicers, they tend to be shorter, thicker, less regularly shaped, and they got a bumpy skin with tiny white or black dotted spines. And color can actually vary from creamy yellow to a pale or dark green. And you're not going to get that bitter or sour sensation like you will with the slicers in that yellow stage. And then we have gherkins. This is not a gherkin. This is actually the English. Not sure if I have a picture of the gherkin, but They're going to be called cornicons, baby dills, or baby pickles. They're going to be small, whole, unsliced cucumbers, typically about 1 to 5 inches in length. And again, they're going to have that bumpy skin, and you pickle those in a multitude of things: brine, vinegar, spices, and sugar. And then we have Burpless cucumbers. Many of you probably have heard of those. They're going to be sweeter and have a much thinner skin than any other variety of cucumber. People really like these because they've been said to be easier to digest, and they've got a very pleasant taste. They can get as long as 2 feet, so be aware of that. They're almost seedless, and they're going to have a really delicate skin. So more often than not, we're going to see these actually grown in greenhouses. And oftentimes these are going to be parked in a carpet. So again, if you see shrink wrapped, oftentimes that's going to be some of these Burpless cucumbers. For those of you that have kids, this is a really cool activity, growing cucumbers in like Coke bottles and things. So you can just click on this and it'll take you right to, or it'll pull up how to do this for your kids or grandkids this summer. As far as harvesting cucumbers, you just want to pick when the seeds are still small and the flesh is firm. Fruit's going to be green because remember, yellowing, especially even picklers that get that bright yellow belly, that's going to be an indication of being overripe, and they're going to have humongous seeds at that stage too. Store these at 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit with higher humidity. You don't often hear me say higher humidity, but cucumbers are going to prefer that. And typically you're going to get about a week. There's going to be some that you're only going to get about 3 to 5 days, so be aware of that. But 1 week is typically what that storage life is going to be. Now, as we move into summer squash, this is going to be a favorite by many, no matter how you eat it: steamed, fried, roasted, whatever. But we do have 5 species that are grown worldwide for the edible fruit of the squash. Now, we do have other kinds of gourd, bottle gourds. Those are going to be native to Africa, and they belong to a totally different genus, but it is going to be in the same family as cucurbit. So that's kind of why I mentioned those a few minutes ago. Oftentimes, those gourds are going to be used for utensils or vessels. Sometimes the young fruit will be eaten. But again, typically 5 species are going to be grown worldwide, and you can kind of see there where they do in fact originate from Central and South America. Now, as far as how did squash get its name, this comes to us from the Narragansett people. That's an Algonquin American Indian tribe from up in the Rhode Island area. And this tribe was nearly landless for most of the 20th century, but it worked to gain federal recognition and actually attained that in 1983. Sorry about that. So it's officially the Narragansett Indian Tribe of Rhode Island, and is made up of descendants of tribal members who were identified in an 1880 treaty with the state. So that's how squash got its name, from the word Ascottusquash, which means eaten raw or uncooked, and I probably butchered that word, but you can see it spelled out there. But that's where that comes from. So we have the Narragansett to thank for that. And again, we have 4 different types. We'll kind of go into detail here: the crookneck, straight neck, scallop, and the zucchini. Squash was actually domesticated first, followed by maize or corn, and then beans. So that's kind of where that 3 sisters gardening and companion planting that you've heard me refer to, how that kind of came to be. So squash was the first one to be domesticated. This is crookneck. This is pretty popular, followed by our straight necks, and then we have the scallop or the patty pan, and then our zucchini, and we have multiple colors of the zucchini as well. In regards to harvest, just make sure that you pick that fruit when the skin's tender and glossy. You want that little bit of sheen on it. Small fruit is often going to be easier to handle and of better quality. So keep that in mind. I store that again with high humidity, about 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can even get up to a couple of weeks of storage life with the squashes, the summer squashes. Now, in regard to winter squash, we'll often get the question, what is the difference between summer and winter squash? Well, the biggest difference is that winter squash are going to have a really thick, tough shell, okay? And you can kind of see that here. You can take like the fingernail of your thumb and actually pierce a winter squash, and it's going to be really tough to do that versus your traditional summer squash. So summer squash too is going to need to be picked when that fruit is immature and the skin is soft, and you eat those immediately. Winter squash, we can actually harvest those, and they're going to have a much longer shelf life. So they're really good as a storage vegetable. Now we've got several different kinds here of this list. Before we get into them, I think Turban, the last one here, is going to be the only one that is an heirloom. So this is our butternuts, and some of you, again, that are participating in the home garden veggie trials have been able to sample some of the smaller, the ones that will almost fit in the palm of your hand type butternuts, and those are very, very tasty. Acorn squash, they've started to increase in popularity as people are learning more and more how to eat these. And then we have marrow squash, or spaghetti squash as it's most often called here in East Tennessee. The Hubbard squash, it's one of the old-fashioned favorites. Dumpling squashes. The blue Hokkaidos. These are a little bit smaller in origin. Then we have the Kabocha, delicata. These are really tasty. The Long Island cheese, which a lot of folks will use for pumpkin pies, the red curry, and then the turban squash. So lots of different types of the winter squashes available. When we harvest winter squash, we want to pick that fruit when the rind has actually hardened. It's going to be really tough to pierce it with your fingernail. Store these at 50 degrees, but you only want moderate humidity compared to our summer squashes and cucumbers. Storage life is going to be all over the place. So if you go back to when we talked about preserving the harvest a couple of weeks ago in that folder in the Google Drive, there's going to be shelf life for specifics of these winter squashes. So keep that in mind. Some are going to have a very short shelf life. Some can extend even throughout the next season, believe it or not. Another thing in regards to storage life is going to be squash bug damage. So that could alter shelf life as well. So keep that in mind. Now, as far as pumpkins, we've got a couple of different ones here, but these are going to be native to North America, northeastern Mexico, and the southern United States, to be more specific. They're going to be one of the oldest domesticated plants. And so we have records that say they've been used as early as 7,500 to 5,000 BC, y'all. So they've been around for quite a while. Just as an FYI, we will lump all pumpkins into winter squash. They are all winter squash. 95% of the U.S. crop intended for processing is actually grown in Illinois. So that was news to me myself. Nestle, who produces, well, this is Libby's, but it's operated by Nestle. They produce 85% of the processed pumpkin in the U.S. And this is also in Illinois, in Morton, Illinois. As far as a little fun fact, and y'all, I think have heard me mention this before in other classes, Pilgrims actually first hollowed out a pumpkin, filled it with apples and sugar, spices, and milk, and then they put that stem back on and they baked it. So there's actually a recipe. You can click on that, and it's, you notice the spelling there. I didn't do that. It's not a spelling error. That's actually how it was spelled, pumpkin pudding, and it was in a 1796 cookbook of American cookery. But you can see what that apple, or not apple, but pumpkin pie would have looked like. And then that's just a picture of what that cookbook looks like. Pumpkins are going to be really versatile in regards to cooking and their uses for cooking, because pretty much all parts of the pumpkin is going to be edible. So the fleshy shell is edible, the seeds, the leaves, and even the flowers. And pepita seeds and pumpkin seed oil has a really robust flavor for cooking all kinds of dishes, sauteing dishes. Now you're going to notice some crossover here from when we talked about winter squash, but I wanted to make sure that I mentioned some of these a little bit more specifically. The blue Hokkaido is going to be very sweet, and it has a nutty flavor. Long Island cheese, again, I'm not going to try to say this word, y'all, but sometimes the Rouge Vidal, yeah, I'm not going to slaughter that word, but sometimes you will call or hear these called Cinderella pumpkins as well. These white pumpkins, believe it or not, are really good for baking cakes. So explore that, y'all. This is really cool. And then the Cherrydale, it's an older variety, still being grown pretty consistently throughout the South, at least. Now, I know it's not Halloween, but I did put a link in here for the history of the jack-o'-lantern. So make sure that you check that out. It's kind of a cool story. A little bit more on the jack-o'-lanterns in the U.S. The carved pumpkin was first associated with the harvest season in general, long before it ever became an emblem or a symbol of Halloween. And you've heard me mention jack-o'-lanterns and pumpkins before, because there is a connection in folklore and popular culture between pumpkins and the supernatural. So a commonplace motif of people being turned into pumpkins by witches. The jack-o'-lantern custom derives from Halloween folklore to ward off imaginary demons or even the devil himself. If you go back to Cinderella, remember that the fairy godmother turns a pumpkin into a carriage, but then at midnight it reverted back to a pumpkin. And then there's some iteration of the folktale, the legend of Sleepy Hollow, because the headless horseman is said to have used a pumpkin as his substitute head. So that's a little bit of a snapshot for folklore for you. Y'all know I can't teach a class without throwing a little bit of that fun stuff in there. Now, this is the Cucurbita Maxima. This is going to be the enormous pumpkins that people are specifically growing for size. And you can see this little tiny pumpkin sitting on top of this great big one. But now these Cucurbita Maxima, they're going to have more of a bush habit rather than a vining habit. So all giant pumpkins, anything that's going to be over 100 pounds, are going to be in this species here. So the largest pumpkins ever documented are going to be Cucurbita Maxima, that species. There's actually documentation of a pumpkin that reached 2,624 pounds, y'all. So that is just crazy. But you can see in comparison, though, these are probably little field trip pumpkins, little jack-o'-lantern pumpkins, but rather enormous pumpkins there. One of my favorites are going to be the candy roasters. Anybody that tuned in to our third Thursday last week up in Berea, Kentucky with Dr. Bill Best heard us mention the candy roasters. So these are actually originating out of that western North Carolina, even into the North Georgia area. Landrace was originally developed by the Cherokee people in the southern Appalachians, and this is considered an heirloom variety. Now, when we say landrace, that just means that it was domesticated or locally adapted itself. So by and large, if you are ever in that western North Carolina region, if you eat pumpkin pie, you're probably eating candy roaster pie. I don't even think that I knew you could eat pumpkin until maybe I was at college, you know, because we never grew pumpkins per se for that purpose. You know, we grew them for Halloween decorations or feeding the pigs, but we never grew them to eat. So I know when I first encountered a true pumpkin pie, I wasn't really impressed, y'all, because I grew up on candy roasters. So I would really encourage you, if you have never tried this, and again, it's going to be more of a winter squash rather than a pumpkin, but make sure you try this. It's really good for making pies. Again, if you have kids or grandkids, this is a pretty cool activity, the erupting pumpkin volcanoes. So be sure to check that out. In regards to harvesting pumpkins, we want to make sure that that fruit's fully grown and colored, but we got to do it before frost. So we know that timing on pumpkins can be a little dicey. So if you do have pumpkins still in the field, make sure you protect those as best as you can if you can't get those picked. Squash bugs are going to run rampant just because we're getting later into the season and they go through multiple stages. So they can be a major pest if you're growing lots of pumpkins. Moderate humidity again for storage at 50 to 55 degrees. Often you're going to get 2 to 3 months storage life on these. Some of these newer hybrids, we can get a little bit longer shelf life. But a lot of that's going to depend on their shell. So a lot of these newer varieties are coming out with like a wartier or thickened outer shell. So it gives them a little bit more preservation opportunity. Okay, moving on to watermelons. You'll see here kind of the region in Africa from where they originated. It was the European colonists and slaves from Africa that actually introduced the watermelon to us here in the New World. So Spanish settlers, they were growing it in Florida in 1576. It was actually being grown in Massachusetts by 1629. And then by 1650, it was cultivated in Peru and Panama, and then a lot of those Dutch and British colonies. And it was around the same time that Native Americans were cultivating the crop in the Mississippi Valley and in Florida. Watermelons, they were rapidly accepted in Hawaii and a lot of those other Pacific islands because they were actually introduced there by Captain Cook. And then the sweet watermelon, which is what Carl Linnaeus formerly described the watermelon, that came to us in 1753, and that was when it was given the name Cucurbita citrillis, but it was reassigned to the genus Citrillis in 1836, and that was by the German botanist Schrader. And here is what an old cultivar of watermelon would have looked like back in the 17th century. So this was actually a painting by Giovanni Stanchi, all on canvas to represent that. Now, watermelons, we've got so many cultivars of these, y'all. And the flesh can be red, pink, orange, yellow, or white, but about 1,200 cultivars. And 44 states are going to grow watermelons. Now, China alone accounts for 68% of total watermelon production. And just as an FYI, you can see the pumpkins behind here, but this was Chris Kent in Sevierville, Tennessee. I don't remember the year, but he grew the biggest watermelon. So just a shout out to our Sevier County folks. We do have many different types. You can see those listed here. The seedless watermelons, they were created in the 1990s. So people that didn't like the watermelon seeds, seedless became the new norm. And these come about just as a result of successive breeding. And so it was that last breeding, it just created melon as sweet as seeded varietals, but it's not greatly improved on low seed germinations. Seedless watermelons are going to have tiny, you can probably see those here, really underdeveloped seeds despite the name, but these are much more easily consumed than the bigger and the black watermelon seeds that we're all typically used to. Most of these melons are going to weigh from about 10 to 20 pounds, and they're going to mature in about 85 days. Now, the picnic watermelon, these are going to be a little bit larger than the seedless, about 16 to 45 pounds or more. So they're going to be perfect for a big picnic gathering or a reunion of sorts. They're going to be the traditional oblong or round melons, and they're going to have that green rind and sweet red flesh. And these two are going to mature about 85 days or so. So Crimson Sweet is going to be one of the more popular varieties of these. Icebox watermelons, these were specifically bred to feed one person or even a small family, and they're much smaller than their counterparts. They're only going to come in about 5 to 15 pounds. So any of you that like the Sugar Baby or the Tiger Baby, this is where these are going to fall. Sugar Babies are going to be sweet pulped with dark green rinds, and these were actually introduced in the late 1950s. The Tiger Babies are actually gold, hence the name. So they're going to mature in about 75 days. And then we have yellow and orange flesh kinds. It's maybe a little off-putting for some people to see that color of flesh. And then the Moon and Stars, you can see how it gets its name from this speckled up color on the rind. Now, seedless watermelons, we always get questions on these. They were developed by Japanese scientists in 1939. They're triploid, so that means they're not going to be able to really produce the seed. Seedless watermelons become more popular, of course, in this century. People didn't like spitting those big seeds out. And then 85% of the total watermelon sales in the USA are going to be the seedless watermelons, and they're going to require warmer soil than any other cucurbit to germinate. Another question we always get is about ripe watermelons. How do we know when these watermelons are ripe? Well, a couple of pictures to kind of help guide that process. That light green curly tendril on the stem near the point of attachment is going to turn brown and dry up. Now, some varieties are going to do this 5 to 10 days before the fruit is fully ripe, but we want to make sure that that tendril is not that bright green, succulent texture, bright green color. We want it to be brown and dried up. The surface color of the fruit loses its really slick appearance, and it's going to turn dull. So much like blackberries, you know, we like the shine and the sheen, but we want to harvest when they have that dull color because that actually indicates to us it's ripe. The skin's going to become really rough, so you can penetrate it with your thumbnail. And then the cultivars that are going to be predominantly dark green are going to turn a buttery yellow on the ground side. Lighter melons will also turn yellow, but they're not going to be as deep as what you're going to see on these darker melons. So always look for a yellow belly. Just a fun fact, grafting watermelon onto squash or gourd rootstock makes firmer and healthier fruit. And for those that don't like tomatoes, like me, I'm sorry, I don't like to eat raw tomatoes, y'all, or tomato sandwiches. I like them cooked in anything. But for those of us that don't eat those ginormous tomatoes, watermelons have more lycopene than tomatoes. So true fact, I had to throw that in there. And then just another fun activity for your kids, making or growing square watermelons. Who doesn't want to do that? You might even want to try that in the garden. It's kind of fun. In regards to harvest, just again, pick that fruit when the tendrils next to the fruit die back and the underside turns that yellow. Store it 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit with high humidity, but you can only store for 2 to 3 weeks. Trust me, I know. I had one of these explode in my kitchen, all over the walls and the ceiling. It looked like, you know, someone had been murdered in my kitchen. It was great fun to clean that mess up. So don't let those linger. They'll just explode from within. Moving on to musk melons, and this is one that we have quite a bit of contention with, but musk melons are actually native to Persia, and cultivation actually spread pretty slowly westward. So by the 15th century, Christopher Columbus, he had actually brought muskmelon seeds with him to the New World. But most of us here in America are raised thinking that this is a cantaloupe, but it isn't. What you see is a muskmelon. And so this is what we sell in the US as a cantaloupe. So what does the real cantaloupe look like? Well, it looks like this. So this is the European cantaloupe. It's going to have a smoother skin. It's going to be much harder to pierce that skin with a fingernail than our native, or not native, our muskmelon here in America. Cantaloupe is going to have a more subtle flavor, and it's not going to be commercially grown here in the US. And that's just because the muskmelon is so much easier to grow, and it's got a much stronger taste. Now, if you want a real European cantaloupe, you're either going to have to go hunt for a local farmer that's actually growing these, or you'll have to find them in European or Mediterranean countries. I will tell you that while I was overseas in Europe, this was something I frequently ate. Would have the cantaloupe, and it's got a much smaller hole on the inside than our traditional muskmelons here in the US, but actually pair a true cantaloupe with a little bit of sweet white wine, and it was always a good light meal while I was working overseas. True cantaloupes are not going to be netted. They're going to have these dark green grooves like that you see here. They are going to have a little bit of a wartier rind, and they're going to have orange or even green flesh. Again, these are only going to be grown in Europe. So that's kind of where the distinction lies between muskmelons and cantaloupes. And the reason that we call them musk melons here in the US is because of that sweet fragrance of the ripe fruit. And the term musk actually comes from a Persian word for perfume. So remember, these originated in Persia, so hence the name musk. One bad thing about some muskmelons, cantaloupes, too much water is going to make the fruit really yucky, dull tasting. It's really going to dilute the sugars down. So keep that in mind. The more rain that we get naturally, or the more that you push water to our muskmelons, and you're going to lose a lot of flavor. Now, honeydew melons, they're going to have a smoother surface than the muskmelons, and they're going to lack that distinctive musky odor. Plus, they're going to ripen later, and they are going to require a longer growing season, which is one reason we can't grow those quite as well here as we do the muskmelons. Powdery mildew resistant strains were developed actually here in the Imperial Valley. You can kind of see where that's out, San Diego, due east of San Diego. As far as harvesting, we want to be able to pull that stem away from the vine. That's what we call slipping. It's just going to fall right off. You're not going to have to do any tugging, jerking, yanking, or anything like that. It's just going to fall off. Honeydew, French melons, and canary melons, they are not going to slip like muskmelons, so be aware of that. These are going to be better stored at 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit with high humidity. So much cooler temperature than any of our other vine crops, and typically get about 2 weeks on these. Now, as far as gourds, these, just as an FYI, can have a hard shell when you dehydrate them. And here's just, to me, it's almost like Easter egg hunting in the fall when you're trying to find all these baby gourds in the field. Lots of different uses for gourds. One of our master gardeners here with the Big Springs, Annie Dunn, has actually done a video, I think we called it Gourd Vibes. So if you're interested in learning how to do some of this, it's also on our web portal. But this is what we'll call a bottle gourd, or sometimes you'll hear these called calabash gourds. So you can actually dry those out, harvest for the seed, use these for crafts. This is a purple martin. So the bottle gourds, that's going to be really popular for folks to use as birdhouses for them. Gourds are also going to be utilized to make many musical instruments. A guiro is a Latin American percussion instrument. Maracas are made from gourds. A sitar, this is looks like a guitar. A sitar looks like a guitar. How about that? Let me try that again. But that's a plucked string instrument. So most of the parts there are going to be made from gourds. And then African percussion instruments are made from incorporating gourds into some of their handy work as well. And last, we'll talk a little bit about loofah. If you've never grown loofah, it's kind of a cool vining crop to grow, but notice there the days to maturity. So it is going to take a lot of time to grow these, but the fruit of these are actually cultivated and eaten as a vegetable, but you have to harvest at a young stage in order for these to be edible. In India, they eat this pretty prolifically. I think it's called gilki, G-I-L-K-I. I may not be saying that right. But then as you let this fruit mature on the vine and it becomes fully developed, then that's where the source of the loofah scrubbing sponge comes from. And that's what we use in bathrooms or in kitchen. Loofahs are not going to be frost hardy, and they are going to require that 150 to 200 warm days to mature. So if you allow that loofah again to fully ripen and dry on the vine, that flesh will actually disappear, and it's only going to leave this fibrous inside skeleton and seeds, and you can just shake those right out. It's kind of cool. Kids really like these. Kind of see those. Of course, they look like any of our other cucurbits. And that's what it's going to look like when the flesh falls away. This is actually peeling that flesh back. And like I say, a lot of people will pour soap into these and use them as bath sponges. Now, as far as pests, we've talked about this in some other classes, but I wanted to give a refresher because bacterial wilt is one that we're going to see a high occurrence of, especially if it continues to stay dry like this. But basically, you go to bed at night, you get up the next morning, and this is what your plant looks like. It looks like you've dumped scalding water over the plant, and you're like, what in the world? But the other bad thing about this is that cucumbers are going to be real sensitive to pesticides. So, you know, we really want to use those as a last resort and follow the label very carefully. Striped cucumber beetles are going to be really active from dusk to dawn. So spraying in the evening is going to be the most effective. And then if you are utilizing pesticide, rotenone and insecticides containing pyrethrin are going to be what we would typically recommend. Now, if your vines become infected, they're going to need to be pulled and removed. Nobody likes to hear that, but there's no cure for bacterial wilt. So get all those vines out of there. And you can kind of see what that looks like. And then this is what we call that slime string. So you can actually drop this down in water, a piece of that stem, and when you pull it out, it's going to string like that. It can affect even the fruit as well. If we get into some pretty heavy populations, which we have seen here in Northeast Tennessee, but you can see the damage that they do. These are going to be striped and spotted. Not a lot of difference other than the pattern on their back. So again, adults are going to feed on the leaves of the plants. That's how the disease is spread. The larvae are going to feed on the plant roots. So here's the biggie, y'all. I harp on cleaning up the gardens in the fall. The reason for that is because a lot of these pests will overwinter in any of that crop or weed debris. Okay, so any type of vegetation that we have bordering our gardens, woodlots, fence rows, that's a potential habitat for some of these pests. So we want to make sure that we keep all that stuff cleaned up and get it sanitized. If we are doing a clean and thorough deep cultivation, and I know some of you don't have the means to do that or don't want to do that, and that's okay, but just want to put that out here that deep cultivation can help annihilate some of these predators. Make sure that you get compost on your garden, and then cover cropping in the fall can really help hinder some of these pests. And this is what that larva is going to look like. The beetles, they're going to show up this time of year. They lay their eggs on the underside of the leaves. So now is a good time to be keeping an eye out for the beetles as soon as your cucumbers are planted. And then just monitor, you know, scout the leaves, destroy any egg sacs that you see like these here. Just squash those. Notice here, delay planting until after June 10th, because right now, this time of year is when populations are so high. Plant multiple rows if you have a lot of pressure. So if you've had these pests in the past, then you're going to continue to have these pests more than likely. So that is what we would say pressure is heavy. Surround the main crop plants. Row covers can be used. And look here, cucumber beetles can smell cucurbit seed germinating. So if you set out transplants, allow your plants to outgrow beetle attacks. That's one good thing about the transplant. Also, allow those plants to become slightly root bound. That also helps as well. Whoops, I had that highlighted so you can actually see that. All right, squash vine borer. This is another one, and you're going to notice that the symptoms look very similar to the cucumber bacterial wilt. So again, this is almost an overnight occurrence. The plants wilt because the larva is actually boring within the lower part of the stem. So again, it looks kind of like scalded water. Squash vine borers attack squash, zucchini, pumpkins, and gourds. If you're growing Hubbard squash, they love Hubbard squash. So some people will actually plant that as a trap crop. Not with the intent of harvesting any Hubbards, but just as a trap crop. So the squash vine borer goes to them and leaves everything else alone. Butternut squash, they don't really care for. Cucumbers and melons are typically not going to be an issue for the squash vine borer. And you can kind of see the damage there. A lot of people will go in at this stage and try to use like a knife or a paper clip to pull that squash vine borer out. You can see him in here, and you notice this gets really soft and sappy, really gross looking, but you can see the damage that has incurred there. And here he is resting inside the stem. So basically what happens here is that these borers, they overwinter in the soil as pupa or cocoons. So when the adult clearwing moths emerge in early to midsummer, they lay their eggs in small groups or even singly, which is another reason that makes them hard to see, at the very base of the stem. So those eggs will hatch typically in about 1 to 2 weeks. And then the larva is what bores into the stems, and they'll feed about 2 to 4 weeks. And then oftentimes they will also bore into the fruit if the plant sustains itself that long. And we can have 2 generations of these in a season. So you can see what those little cocoon pupae look like. So if you see these, that's not a good thing in your garden, y'all. And this is actually what the moth looks like. If you catch it early enough, it is possible to save the plant. If you catch it after the eggs hatch, it may be too late. Controlling this critter here is all about prevention, being proactive. And you can see those eggs. That's what I was talking about, laying singly. So you really have to look at this to be able to differentiate, you know, that is in fact an egg casing versus them being in clusters. So that's just blowed up so you can see that better. And then you've heard me mentioning the squash bug, and notice here, you're going to get multiple life cycles throughout a season, but this is why it's so detrimental to our pumpkins. And this is literally what you will see in the early fall of the year as we're starting harvest. So they can wreak a lot of havoc. You can see the damage here. If you've only got a few vines that are involved, then the easiest way to control is just to hand collect the eggs and the bugs. The eggs are going to be, I think I have a picture of that. Eggs are about 1/6 of an inch long. They're going to be elliptical, yellowish to brown to bronze, and they're always going to be in clusters, but they're on the underside of the leaves. So again, good sanitation is going to reduce those overwintering populations. But if you do have these, apply an insecticide. That's going to help control those young nymphs, because the adults are going to be really hard to control, as you can see with that really hard shell. They kind of resemble a stink bug, but they're going to have this piercing, sucking mouth part, and that's what they use to suck the sap out of the leaves. And that's where we get those yellow spots that turn brown and fall out. Now, this feeding that they do also disrupts the flow of water and nutrients, and that's where that wilting phenomenon is going to come from. So, unlike cucumber beetles, squash bugs do not vector diseases. You would think that they would, but they don't. Now, here's the other thing. Younger plants are going to be more susceptible to damage and may die from pretty extensive feeding. If you've got larger and more vigorous and healthy plants, they're going to be a little bit more tolerant of feeding damage, but they can too be injured or killed if they are severely attacked. Squash bugs are going to overwinter as adults in any sheltered place. So under plant debris, around buildings, under rocks. So another reason sanitation is key. When these adults emerge in the spring, they fly to growing cucurbit plants and they feed and mate. And then these female squash bugs lay their eggs individually or in small clusters on the underside of the leaves. Typically it's going to be in clusters, but they'll typically lay these leaves between the veins where they actually form the V shape in the leaf. Sometimes though you will see eggs on the stems, but the females will usually start appearing in gardens about this time of year, y'all, and they're going to continue laying eggs all summer long. That's why we'll see this, because eggs are going to hatch in about 10 days. The nymphs are going to require about 4 to 6 weeks before they too mature into adults. And then the adults and nymphs are secretive and they scurry around and look for cover when they get disturbed. Only one generation develops each year, but it's possible that in some summers there's going to be a partial second generation because those life cycles or the life stages overlap, and all of them can be seen at any given time during the growing season. So that's why we see this. In the fall, especially after the vines have died, the adults and the late instar nymphs, they'll congregate on squash fruits. The nymphs are going to die when the temperatures drop to freezing, but then the adults will fly or crawl to sheltered places to bed down and hibernate for the winter. The most important times to control squash bugs are going to be when the plants are young, like right now, and when they are flowering. I can't talk tonight. Squash bugs are going to be less important to control later in the growing season because they've pretty much already done their damage, and that late season feeding is not really considered very serious. Early detection of nymphs is going to be important though, because as adult squash bugs get larger, that's when they're going to be more difficult to kill because they've developed that exterior hard shell. A few more things before we wind up, just to again showcase downy mildew. You're going to see this on the top, kind of looks like polka dots on the top and on the bottom. You can also see some powdery intermingled. Oftentimes we will see both. That's why I'm showing both of those to you, but you can actually see the fungal spores here proliferating along the main stem of this leaf margin, and you can kind of see how they will infloresce together, and eventually if not treated, these will just coalesce and fall right out of the leaf. Powdery mildew is going to be very similar, but it's going to look like powder has actually been sprinkled on that plant. Neem oil is often used as an organic control, but remember, cucurbits don't really like pesticides. Remember, we prefaced the presentation with that. Not to say that you can't utilize some of these chemicals, but we have seen stunting occur. Burn potential is really high with neem, so just be cautious with that. Y'all can't see me, but I can give you the testament on this more than once. I've used it and it's burned them up. But again, the powdery mildew, we're going to see that even on watermelons like you see here. If we get too high of an infection rate, we're going to see it on all parts of that plant. Chlorothalonil and mancozeb are going to be fungicides that will be go-tos. Usually this time of year, wait until the first appearance of disease symptoms before you start applying. If you plant any of these in the summer, that's when you want to start a preventative spray program. So when those vines begin running, that's when you want to start applying those fungicides. Now, again, that's just when you plant in the summertime. Don't use sprinkler irrigation. We want that water at the soil line. Make sure that you're incorporating crop rotation practices. That's going to help control powdery. It won't control downy, but it will control powdery. Giant pumpkins are going to be less susceptible to downy than other pumpkin types. And then loofah is actually going to be resistant to all of these diseases. So that's kind of cool. I mean, we can eat it, we can take a bath with it, and then it's resistant to all of these diseases. So really cool. Just one last picture there of powdery. And then anthracnose. You've heard me talk about these in other crops. So this is just showing you what that's going to look like. Almost looks like the fringe, the outer edges of those leaves are burnt back. Again, chlorothalonil or mancozeb is going to be what we go to first. Now, also in, I guess it's your IPM folder, is the manual for our organic and conventional spray control measures. So I will also go pop that into this folder as well for you. But just as an FYI, it's in that folder as well. But you can see what that's going to look like on the fruit itself. Often cucumbers will display anthracnose. Even in the grocery stores, you'll see this often. And then alternaria, which is the same causal agent for early blight in tomatoes. We can see that target spot showing up. We can see those spots starting to coalesce. But this is what makes alternaria so distinctive, is in fact that target spot. This is what it's going to look like actually on the fruit. So yucky looking. And then blossom end rot, it just doesn't happen in tomatoes, y'all. It can happen in our watermelons. You can see that. It's lack of calcium and inconsistent water fluctuations. In regards to some nutrient deficiencies, often brought in thinking that it's disease, this is what we actually have: magnesium and manganese deficiency. They almost look like viral diseases when they mosaic up like that. But magnesium is going to begin with this chlorosis, that yellowing. And sometimes you'll have a red, maybe an orange coloration of your older leaves. So if you see that, that could be magnesium. Manganese start as this mottling chlorosis, and then the leaves become yellow, and they'll develop these necrotic lesions. So not good. This is what I was talking about in cucumbers. Hollowness or open cavities can be caused by inadequate pollination and reduced seed set. So if you see this little skinny end and it's kind of soft and mushy, that's often going to indicate lack of pollination. If you bite into a cucumber, again, get these hollow pockets. This is really small. Sometimes you'll get them really big. That's going to be an indicator of boron deficiency, or even boron and calcium together deficiency. And like I say, the larger that hollow, then the more lacking of boron and quite possibly calcium you'll be. Just to finish this up, I'm not sure how long I've been sitting here talking. I can't see the clock. Maybe a little over an hour. But just some tips on growing vertical. You can tie all of these vine crops up with a whole number of things, from t-shirts, old bras, old hammocks, pantyhose, sheets, you name it. Multiple ways to be able to grow these up. Get more airflow, more air drainage. Get them off the ground, less disease pressure, less insect pressure. I'm going to speed through this pretty quick, but you can go back and look at the pictures on the PowerPoint a little bit better, so you can kind of see how even in this, y'all, slinging them. Old bikini top, see, don't throw none of that stuff out, y'all. We can use all of these things in our gardens. It may look a little funny to the passersby, but hey, that's okay. Some of these can be pretty versatile. Put a lot of creativity in some of these different structures. It's all about how much you're willing to invest in the project. But again, you can see how clean that fruit is, how much easier it is going to be on you to pick. Or folks that are just using upcycling anything from the trash bin, or using sticks, old ladders, hog panels that you can use, even bending that into a trellis support. So lots of different methodologies there to get your vine crops growing up instead of sprawling out all over the ground. If you do let them sprawl on the ground, make sure you get that mulch cover. That's going to reduce weeds. It's going to keep the soil temperatures consistent, and it's going to prevent that fruit from lying on the soil and potentially harboring any kind of disease issues. And it's going to keep the insect populations at bay a little bit better too. And that is all I have in regards to cucurbits, y'all. So too bad we didn't get to do this live in person on Zoom last night. But if any of this has stimulated questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me via email at mteague@utk.edu, or go to our Ask Us portal on the bsmga.com website and submit your question there. So I will see you all in a couple of weeks. Have a great week.